Imagine a world where pain wasn't just a sensation, but a spectacle, where creativity wasn't used to build, but to break. Now, think about those gruesome scenes in movies like The Passion of the Christ or Saw, where pain and suffering are turned into something that's almost unbearable to watch. Imagine that level of brutality wasn't confined to the big screen, but was an everyday reality in history's darkest chapters. Back then, torture wasn't just about punishment. It was a calculated performance, a horrifying blend of pain, fear, and control, designed to make even the strongest beg for mercy. From devices that twisted limbs into unrecognizable shapes to methods so psychological they destroyed the mind before the body, humanity's capacity for cruelty seemed boundless. In this video, we uncover the chilling stories behind these instruments of suffering and why humanity's darkest inventions are best left where they belong, in the history books. And you did be thankful they don't exist today. Let's begin with the rack. When it comes to torture devices, few are as infamous or terrifying as the rack. If you've ever heard the phrase, "stretch to your limits," this device is quite literally where it comes from. The rack wasn't some random tool of the past. It was a centerpiece of medieval torture chambers and a symbol of ultimate suffering. The design itself was deceptively simple. A large wooden frame, almost like a table. The victim's ankles and wrists were tied to rollers on opposite ends. But here's where it gets nasty. By turning the rollers, the ropes would tighten, slowly pulling the body in opposite directions. Think about your joints, your shoulders, your hips, your knees. Now imagine the gradual, sickening sensation of those joints dislocating one by one as your body is stretched far beyond its natural limits. But why use something so horrific? The rack wasn't just about pain. It was a psychological weapon. Often it was used to extract confessions or force someone to name co-conspirators. Imagine being tied down, knowing that each turn of the rollers meant more pain, more dislocated joints, and more tearing of ligaments. And even if you were tough enough to hold out, the threat of permanent damage was always there. Once someone was released from the rack, they often couldn't stand, walk, or even use their arms again. One of the most notorious users of the rack was the Spanish Inquisition. Their goal wasn't just punishment, it was domination, breaking people both physically and mentally. Sometimes they wouldn't tighten the rollers. Just a few cranks made the victims scream and beg for mercy. And let's not forget the sound, the cracking of bones, the popping of joints, the screams. It wasn't only horrifying for the victim. It sent a message to anyone who dared to rebel or resist. The Iron Maiden. If the rack is about slowly pulling you apart, the Iron Maiden is about encasing you in pure terror. Before we get into the details, let's clarify something. Historians debate whether the Iron Maiden was used or was more of a symbolic threat. Either way, its design is enough to make your skin crawl. The Iron Maiden looks like something from a horror movie. A tall, coffin-like structure, often shaped like a human figure. But here's the twist. The inside was lined with long, sharp spikes. Imagine being forced to stand inside, the doors closing around you, the spikes pressing into your skin. Not deep enough to kill instantly, but just enough to pierce the flesh and hold you in constant, unimaginable pain. One of the most famous versions of the Iron Maiden was the Maiden of Nuremberg. It was designed with spikes that were strategically placed to avoid vital organs, ensuring that the victim wouldn't die quickly. Instead, they'd bleed out slowly, sometimes over hours or days. The Iron Maiden wasn't just about physical pain, but a psychological nightmare. being locked inside a confined space, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper into your body, must have been pure hell. And then there's the humiliation. Victims were often stripped of their dignity before being forced into the device, adding another layer of torment. Some accounts suggest that the Iron Maiden was used during public executions or as a warning to others. Just like the rack, Iron Maiden was as much about control as it was about pain. Its mere existence served a purpose, whether used or displayed as a threat. It created fear, silenced dissent, and showcased the power of those in charge. The Brazen Bull. If pain had a soundtrack, the Brazen Bull would be its lead performer. This device wasn't just about torture. It was an outright theatrical production of suffering. Picture a hollow, life-sized bull made entirely of bronze, with a hatch on its side and a hollow interior designed to fit a human. It sounds like a gruesome art piece. It was far worse. The victim was shoved into the metallic bull, the hatch sealed tight, leaving them trapped in darkness. Then, the real horror began. A fire was lit underneath the bull, slowly heating the bronze. As the metal got hotter, the person inside would roast alive, their screams of agony echoing through the bull's interior. But here's the twisted part. The design wasn't just for cooking people alive. The bull had acoustic pipes and vents built into its head, so the screams would sound like the angry bellowing of a beast. The Brazen Bull is often attributed to Phalaris, a tyrant of ancient Greece, who reportedly commissioned its creation. Ironically, the creator of this monstrous device, Parallaeus, is said to have been its first victim. Talk about poetic justice. This torture method was designed not only to kill, but to dehumanize. Turning someone's pain into a literal performance stripped away their humanity. It reduced them to nothing more than a grotesque spectacle. The Judas Cradle. Next, we have a device combining physical agony with sheer humiliation, the Judas Cradle. This torture instrument was a simple yet excruciatingly effective way to inflict unimaginable pain. This device was a favorite during the Spanish Inquisition, a period infamous for its use of torture to extract confessions or punish heretics. The Judas Cradle was essentially a wooden pyramid with a sharp, pointed top. The victim would be hoisted up and lowered onto the pyramid, with the pointed end placed at a sensitive area of their body. The weight of their own body did the rest. Gravity ensured that the victim would slowly slide further down the point, causing intense pain and internal injuries. But the horror didn't stop there. To make the experience even worse, victims were often tied or bound in a way that left them completely powerless to adjust their position or shift their weight. And let's not forget the added layer of humiliation. Victims were often left naked, exposed to both their torturers and any onlookers. The Judas Cradle wasn't just about the physical agony. It was about psychological torment, too. The fear of slipping further down, the shame of exposure, the knowledge that there was no way out. It was a complete assault on the mind and body. One of the cruelest aspects of the Judas Cradle was its slow pace. Death didn't come quickly. Victims would endure hours, sometimes days, of agony before succumbing to their injuries or infection. And yes, infection was almost a guarantee. The cradle wasn't exactly cleaned between uses, making it a breeding ground for disease. Scaphism. The boat torture. Let's linger a bit longer on the nightmare that was scaphism, because honestly, it's hard to wrap your head around just how horrifying it really was. The genius, if you can even call it that, of this method was its ability to use every element of nature against the victim. Imagine lying there, trapped between two wooden shells, unable to move, covered in your own filth. The milk and honey force feeding wasn't just a cruel joke, it was calculated. This sticky, sugary concoction not only attracted insects, but also ensured that the victim stayed alive long enough to truly experience the full extent of their torture. The warmth of the sun, the humidity of the environment, and the suffocating stench all worked together to turn the victim's body into a living, decaying buffet for insects. There's even a psychological layer to scaphism. The victim would remain conscious for days, fully aware of what was happening. They'd feel the bugs crawling on them, biting them, and burrowing into their skin. They'd hear the buzzing, smell the rotting flesh, and know there was no escape. It's hard to imagine a more complete form of physical and mental torment. The victim was often left in public view, serving as a gruesome warning to others. It was a slow, agonizing death, designed to strip away every ounce of dignity. And when death finally came, it was almost merciful compared to the torture the victims endured beforehand. The pair of anguish. From a gruesome punishment like scaphism, we move to something smaller but equally horrifying. The pair of anguish. This deceptively simple device is proof that torture didn't need to be elaborate to be effective. The pair of anguish was a metal device shaped like a fruit, hence the name, but its function was anything but sweet. It consisted of 4 metal leaves that could be expanded outward using a screw mechanism. The device was inserted into one of 3 orifices: mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the victim's supposed crime. Once inserted, the screw was turned, causing the leaves to expand and stretch the orifice beyond its natural limits. The pain was immediate and excruciating. The tissues would tear, and the victim would be left with severe internal injuries. In some cases, the pair's metal leaves were even equipped with spikes, adding an extra layer of agony. But the pair of anguish wasn't just about physical pain. It was also deeply symbolic. The specific orifice targeted was often chosen to humiliate the victim, making the torture not just painful, but deeply degrading. For example, women accused of witchcraft or adultery might have the pair inserted vaginally. In contrast, men accused of sodomy or blasphemy might endure rectal insertion. This device wasn't meant to kill, at least not immediately. Instead, it was used to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. The injuries it caused were often severe enough to lead to infection or death in the days that followed. Still, the primary goal was to make the victim suffer as much as possible in the moment. The breaking wheel. Moving on from the horror of the pair of anguish, we come to the medieval breaking wheel. This device was both a method of execution and a brutal display of power. It was also known as the Catherine wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria. This device wasn't just about killing. It was designed to break both the body and the spirit. The breaking wheel was large, circular, and made of heavy wood, with spokes extending out from the center. The victim would be tied to the wheel, usually in a spread eagle position, and then a series of cruel steps would follow. First, the victim's limbs were often broken with a heavy, blunt object. The idea was to fracture bones and render the person completely immobile. Once the limbs were shattered, the victim would be attached to the wheel, and the wheel would be hoisted up, suspended in the air, on display for the world to see. The public execution of the victim would follow as onlookers watched. Sometimes, victims would be left in public for hours or even days, their broken bodies becoming a grotesque symbol of the consequences of defying authority or law. The punishment wasn't just about death. It was about sending a message, one that would stick with both the victim and the spectators. The psychological toll of the breaking wheel was enormous. The victim was often fully aware of what was happening to them, both during the physical torment and in the moments before death. The public nature of the execution, the suffering, and the lingering effect of seeing someone slowly die in this manner meant that the breaking wheel was one of the most dreaded instruments of torture in medieval Europe. It wasn't just the pain that made the breaking wheel so terrifying. It was the humiliation. Victims were often criminals or those accused of serious crimes, but it didn't matter. The breaking wheel didn't discriminate. No one was safe from its brutal, humiliating grip. In a twisted way, it was meant to serve as a deterrent. The water torture. Now let's talk about one of the most psychologically brutal forms of torture that existed: water torture. While it might sound simple, the methods used were incredibly sophisticated in the ways they inflicted mental anguish. The idea was to simulate the feeling of drowning, creating an overwhelming sense of panic and helplessness in the victim. One of the most infamous methods of water torture was called the water cure. This method involved forcing the victim to drink large amounts of water, sometimes to the point where their stomach would become distended and painfully bloated. But the psychological torment didn't stop there. In some cases, the victim's mouth would be kept open and water would be poured into the throat, causing the feeling of suffocation. What made water torture especially terrifying was the sensation of being unable to breathe. The victim would struggle for air, choking on the water that flooded their throat. The brain would send panic signals as the body instinctively fought to breathe. This created a torturous mental battle where the victim constantly feared they were going to die. If the victim passed out from lack of air, they would often be revived with more water, creating a never-ending cycle of fear and panic. Another form of water torture that became infamous is the drip. This method was much simpler, but no less effective. A single drop of water would be dripped onto the victim's forehead and continue at regular intervals for hours, sometimes days. The sensation of that constant drip, drip, drip would drive the victim insane over time. It was psychological torture at its finest, simple, repetitive, and utterly maddening. Water torture was often used to extract confessions, and it was effective because it preyed on the victim's deepest fear, the fear of drowning. There was no escape, no way to fight the sensation of suffocating. It was both physically and mentally draining, and it often resulted in the victim's complete mental breakdown. While water torture was commonly used in various parts of the world, it remained one of the most insidious methods because it toyed with the victim's instinct to survive. You can't escape the terror of drowning, and once it starts, there's no relief in sight. It's no wonder it's considered one of the most harrowing forms of psychological torture in history. The breaking of the mind. Not all forms of torture were about physical pain. Sometimes the most brutal tortures weren't those that left scars on the body, but those that shattered the mind. Psychological torture, while often overlooked when discussing historical tortures, can be just as, if not more, devastating. This form of torment sought to break the victim's spirit, leaving them completely vulnerable and often willing to do anything to escape. The methods for psychological torture were as varied as they were cruel. The classic example is the use of isolation. Victims would be locked away in small, dark rooms, sometimes for years, with little to no human contact. The complete absence of social interaction and sensory stimulation led to extreme feelings of loneliness, paranoia, and despair. Victims often lose track of time, and their sense of self and reality deteriorates. deprived of basic human contact and comfort, the mind would break down. In extreme cases, the isolation lead to hallucinations and irreversible mental damage. Another form of psychological torture was sleep deprivation. Depriving someone of sleep, especially over long periods, can result in hallucinations, paranoia, and an inability to think or function normally. Sleep deprivation messes with the brain's ability to process information and regulate emotions, effectively reducing the victim to a state of mental collapse. Victims who were kept awake for days or even weeks on end would eventually lose all sense of time and reality. Their mind would become so frazzled that even simple tasks or coherent thoughts would become impossible. Fear was another key component of psychological torture. Some victims were forced to endure terrifying scenarios, like being put into situations where they were made to believe they were about to die, only to be spared at the last second. The constant uncertainty about whether or not they would survive each day took a significant toll on their mental state. The sheer terror of living in constant fear, waiting for death to come, was an emotional and psychological wound that often left lasting scars, even if the victim physically survived. The most insidious aspect of psychological torture, however, was that it didn't leave any visible scars. Unlike physical torture, which was clearly identifiable by bruises, scars, or broken bones, psychological torture left its victims hollowed out in ways that were invisible to the eye. The trauma would stay with them for the rest of their lives, affecting their ability to trust others, their emotional well-being, and their mental health. For the victim, survival didn't necessarily mean escaping the torment. It meant carrying the weight of it forever. These methods, whether physical or psychological, show the terrifying ways in which human beings have been manipulated, controlled, and broken throughout history. Each form of torture, while designed to inflict maximum suffering, reveals just how far some would go in their pursuit of power, control, and vengeance. Torture is, in many ways, a twisted reflection of the worst aspects of human nature, and it's a reminder of how cruel history has been, particularly when it comes to those deemed expendable or guilty. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in our next video.